Hi, everyone. I'm Peggy Zardoust. I'm the Inclusion and Pro Bono Program Specialist here at the Cleveland Metropolitan Bar Association. And on behalf of CMBA, we'd like to thank you for joining us for this Hot Talk in webinar format. This Hot Talk is also being live streamed on Facebook and will also be available in a recorded format in the future on our website, Facebook and YouTube page, so you can share it with your friends if you enjoy our talk. We hope that this will be an informative session for you about the Afghan refugee and immigrant crisis, if you will, certainly an of the moment issue. And we hope that you feel free to ask your questions. We will be having time for questions at the end. I'll introduce our moderator first. Patrick Espinosa has started his own law firm, Sus Abogados Latinos, which is the first Spanish language only law firm in the state of Ohio, handling any client needs for the Spanish speaking population. He earned a JD MBA and has lived all over the world, was born abroad. And so this is a issue close to home for him as an immigrant. Adrian Coppola is supervising attorney at Catholic Charities, specifically the Catholic Charities, Immigration Legal Services. And she is here in the Diocese of Cleveland. Francis Boonsang is an immigration attorney at Margaret Wong and Associates, and he has more than 10 years of experience in immigration and nationality law. Joe Simperman is a former Cleveland City Council member who has joined Global Cleveland as its president. He served on City Council for 18 years and served a very diverse council area. And he is a graduate of St. Ignatius High School and John Carroll University. And Andrew Maffei is at Catholic Charities Diocese of Cleveland as well, in the Office of Migration and Refugees, and he served as volunteer coordinator there since 2015. Thank you all so much for joining us. I will let Pat take it away with the questions.
Thank you, Pega. Thank you to all our panelists for your time and expertise on this issue. And thank you for everybody joining us to learn about our new Afghan neighbors to be. The first portion of this program will be kind of a rundown of what the legal issues are, more informational, and then we'll open up into more of how we can help. So I guess we'll get right to it. And this first question is for Adriana, and panelists, if you feel free to jump in if you want something to add, but we all know that the Taliban took control of Afghanistan after the US withdrawal. Are you able to recap the current situation in terms of events that happened and the number of Afghans that have come to the US, and how many do we expect in Cleveland?
Yes, thank you. And thanks for the CMBA for having me. I can give a broad overview of the events that took place since the US withdrawal of Afghanistan. During the withdrawal, the US military, along with other governments, evacuated more than 120,000 people from Afghanistan. In addition to US citizens and permanent residents and citizens of allied countries, the US evacuated more than 65,000 vulnerable Afghans. These individuals were then taken to various military bases in third countries, where they underwent medical and security screenings prior to being transported to the United States. Once arriving in the United States, the Afghan evacuees were provided temporary housing at 8 different military bases inside the United States, where they received further medical and security screenings, as well as legal orientations and assistance with immigration processing. The majority of Afghans admitted were granted humanitarian parole, a temporary status that allows them to legally remain in the United States for a period of 2 years. These individuals will eventually be referred to a resettlement agency for resettlement in the United States. Where they end up depends on several factors, including if they have a US tie, whether the individual, where that US tie is located, if they have one, and a resettlement agency's capacity to host them. So Cleveland has 3 resettlement agencies. We have Catholic Charities, Migration and Refugee Services, Us Together, and the US Committee for Refugee and Immigrants. In total, the three groups have agreed to receive around 300 Afghan parolees into the community, and that's the latest number that I heard. So Andy, if you have a different number, just let me know. Andy on the call, I think, is going to talk a little bit more about the resettlement process in more detail. Ohio as a whole, I believe, has agreed to resettle 855 Afghans. This number is likely to be an underestimation, as parolees may choose to migrate to this area after an initial placement. Also, the number does not include applications that were filed for vulnerable Afghans who are still in Afghanistan. So shortly after the Taliban took over, our office, in collaboration with Global Cleveland and the Refugee Response, hosted an emergency clinic. It was a humanitarian parole clinic where we assisted Afghans in the community apply for family and friends whose lives were at risk in Afghanistan. Global Cleveland and the Refugee Response raised about $185,000 to assist with filing fees. And with the help of over, I think it's like 90 pro bono attorneys across the state of Ohio, we've filed 1,000 humanitarian parole applications. So what's important to take away from that is that while there are roughly around 60,000 Afghans that are at the military bases right now that are going to be resettled in our area, there are still thousands and thousands of Afghans that are at risk in Afghanistan that we're still trying to bring into the area. We don't really know what the final numbers are for those yet. So that's just like an overview of the timeline of everything that's happened and the arrival numbers. Yeah.
All right, thank you, Adriana. Francis, we're going to turn to you so you can explain more of the legal process of how we're going to resettle our new Afghan neighbors. Can you explain what types of visas are available to the Afghan parolees, and what's the difference between the different visa types? Are there certain conditions that need to be met to have a certain visa approved? And if so, what are those conditions, and how easy it for these parolees to meet those conditions, considering they left their country under such duress and under such a rush that in most cases, many of these people just left with the clothes on their back?
Sure, Patrick. So what are the legal options for Afghans? First, there's what's called the Special Immigrant Visa, and there are two programs. One is for Afghans who are employed by the US government or the International Security Assistance Force, who have been employed for at least 1 year and have experienced a serious threat as a consequence of that employment. Now, the applicant also has to have a letter of recommendation from a supervisor or senior official, and it's a lengthy process. First, the documents are submitted to the State Department, and if approved, then there's a petition that's filed with the Immigration Service here in the United States, and if that's approved, then there's a visa interview that is scheduled overseas. Now, there's also a separate program for Afghan translators and interpreters who are employed by the US government. So they would have served for at least 1 year and also have a letter of recommendation from the US Armed Forces or embassy. And to apply, there's a petition that's filed with the Immigration Service in the United States, and then there's a visa interview scheduled overseas. Now, there's also the refugee program, which is for individuals fleeing persecution. In August of this year, the State Department announced a special Priority 2 or P2 designation for Afghans who don't qualify for the Special Immigrant Visa Program. So these could be individuals who worked for the US government or military, but didn't have the minimum 1 year of employment, or maybe worked for the US media or an NGO or a US funded program. So there's no direct application for the refugee program. You have to be referred by a US government agency or the senior most employee of the media or NGO organization to the State Department refugee program. If the State Department approves the application, then there's an interview process, background checks, and then sponsorship by a Refugee Resettlement Agency in the United States. Now, these are all lengthy processes. It can take 2 to 4 years to get to the United States, and they often require travel to a third-party country and getting documentation from the US military or US employers. And so this means that when you hear the term refugee used to describe Afghans entering the United States in recent months, they technically aren't refugees in the legal sense, because refugees have permanent status when they arrive, and they're immediately eligible eventually to apply for a green card, as are special immigrant visa applicants. And so most Afghans who are entering are actually coming here on temporary humanitarian travel permit called parole. And so Adriana is going to talk about that next.
Now, real quick to recap, are there any of the Afghans being classified as refugees, or is that a much longer process?
It's a much longer process. Like I said, it could take usually about 2 years for refugees to go through all of the background checks and application process. And so they could be expedited, but recently in the past few months, they're almost all parolees.
Okay, thank you, Francis. Adriana, now there's a difference between being eligible for and applying for a visa versus being eligible for humanitarian parole. Can you explain the difference between the two and the requirements?
Yeah, and Francis talked a bit about SIV and P1 and P2, but the other most common visas available are family-based and employment-based, both of which take a long time to process. They could take years, they could take decades in some cases. And they require, an eligible individual in the United States to file, like a spouse to file for another spouse, or a minor child, or a parent. So there's different categories for those. The vast majority of Afghans coming to the US are being admitted through humanitarian parole, like Francis just stated. It's a process that has been used in the past to quickly process like a designated group who need to be moved immediately. It has the advantage of allowing people to enter quickly, and administratively was the only way to admit a large number of Afghans. I guess we can start with the word parole. It has different connotations depending on the area of law that you practice. Under the Immigration and Nationality Act, parole is a tool that allows certain individuals to enter and stay in the United States without a visa, that being without a non-immigrant visa or an immigrant visa. Humanitarian parole is a form of parole that allows an individual outside of the United States to enter the US for urgent humanitarian reasons. While visa processing can take years to complete, a parole process may take weeks or even days to complete theoretically, when they're not inundated with hundreds of thousands of humanitarian parole requests. So you can see why something like this is an important tool to have in an emergency situation. Anyone can self-petition for parole at a US embassy abroad, and sponsors inside the United States can also file on behalf of individuals who may be eligible. So that clinic that we held that I mentioned earlier, we had Afghan family members that have been in the United States for years, who wanted to bring their family members at risk. They were the sponsors of the individuals that were coming. Beyond these guidelines, there's not a strictly defined eligibility requirement for the parole process. It's always decided on a case-by-case basis. The individual wanting to travel to the United States has to provide evidence of this urgent need. So in this situation for vulnerable Afghans, we have been providing proof of employment with the US military, the Afghan military, or the Afghan police, or military forces of allied countries, or we've been providing evidence of somebody's job as a reporter, as an activist, so on and so forth. We are submitting country condition resources documenting the human rights violations perpetrated by the Taliban against these vulnerable Afghans. And in addition, we have like personal declarations from sponsors detailing the need for the urgent travel and the circumstances that their family or friend is experiencing right now in Afghanistan. In addition to that evidence, every single humanitarian parole application has to be submitted with a document called an Affidavit of Support. USCIS requires evidence that the individual that wants to travel to the United States has a sponsor who can provide financial support to the parolee throughout the duration of their stay. So after an individual is deemed eligible for parole, the government will conditionally approve the humanitarian parole application. That individual abroad then has to submit another application online, go to a US embassy for further screening and to pick up their boarding foil, which is a document that allows them to board a commercial flight to the United States. And then they eventually have to travel to the US within a given time frame. Under the Operation Allies Refuge Parole program, which was created by the government in response to this humanitarian crisis, Afghans are admitted on parole and are granted protection from deportation for 2 years, and they're eligible to apply for work authorization. So what happens after that? While some Afghans may be eligible for an immigrant visa based on family reunification petitions or SIV status, say they had a pending SIV case abroad or P2, they can remain here while that application is processing. But we expect that many of the individuals that arrived as parolees are going to need to apply for asylum based on past persecution or fear of future persecution in Afghanistan on account of a protected ground. In preparation for this, the government recently passed a continuing resolution that allowed for expedited processing of asylum applications for Afghan parolees. Typically, the affirmative asylum process can take years. I have cases that have been pending for about 4 years affirmatively, meaning they're not in court. Under this resolution, USCIS is expected to make a decision on an asylum application submitted in 150 days. So I don't have a lot of hope that that's very realistic, but we will see. If asylum is granted, then eventually that individual can apply for permanent residence and US citizenship. So the pathway is much more complicated. All these individuals are going to need immigration assistance once they, because their parole status is only valid for 2 years.
Now, is there any way to extend that parole status for them?
Yeah, you can renew it. And that decision to renew is discretionary. The government can grant or deny that. So it's important to kind of determine what your relief may be in the United States within those 2 years and start that process.
So you're saying some of these processes take 4 years, they can keep renewing it until they're eventually granted some form of relief, right?
That's correct, yeah.
Okay, great. Thank you, Adriana. I know you've covered a lot of the stuff in this next question coming up. This next question coming up is for both you and Matt. And like I said, you're going to probably be touching twice on some of these things I'm asking, but can you explain the resettlement process nationwide and specifically Cleveland? I understand that many Afghan nationals are being temporarily housed at military bases. What's the process by which they are resettled here in Cleveland and in other cities? And which of the Cleveland-based organizations that have led the charge to bring Afghan parolees to Cleveland? Also, the national media has reported a vetting process. Can you explain what this vetting process means?
Yeah, I'll let you take the first part and I'll talk about the vetting process.
Great. So refugee resettlement, and Francis has brought up a few of these pieces already, but I'll expand upon them slightly. Refugees who are admitted into the United States first have to be referred to US embassies by the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees. The mandate under the UNHCR is resettlement to a third country. And as Francis mentioned, the vetting procedure can take between 24 and 48 months. So it's quite lengthy. And that's done by the Department of Homeland Security and specifically Citizenship and Immigration Services, or USCIS. Resettlement in the United States is basically a process that first you see a security screening, and then after that, the Bureau for Population, Refugees, and Migration coordinates the admission into the United States. There are approximately 250 cities throughout the United States that have refugee resettlement agencies, and those cities have affiliate sites that are associated with what's called a volunteer agency. There are 9 different volunteer agencies. Most of them are faith-based organizations, and they are the ones who sign that cooperative agreement with the Bureau for Population, Refugees, and Migration. And to be specific, to PRM is a sub-office of the State Department. So they coordinate all of that up front, and then they place people at individual affiliate sites, like I said. Our office, for example, then receives the families at the airport. And prior to that too, and I kind of did this out of order, we are charged with finding a rental property that is appropriately sized, and also putting in items to a house that are, what you would need for basic survival. So nothing that would be considered, I use scare quotes here, a luxury item. So no microwaves or cars or anything like that. These would be beds, dressers, as well as toiletries, things to cook with, places to sit, lights, etc. So that's all moved in prior to the family arriving, which our office would then pick people up from the airport and then take them back to the house. And that begins what's called their reception and placement period, which lasts between 30 and 90 days if each step within that reception and placement process is not complete. The reception and placement process includes making sure everyone has up-to-date immunizations. After those immunizations are up to date, kids are enrolled in school. Adults are referred to English as a second language classes. Cuyahoga Community College, and specifically the Aspire program, hosts those classes for people all over the city. After that, adults are enrolled in public benefits, and our office and other offices across the country shop for families for groceries during that initial period. And at that point, you're effectively cut from the dock and pushed out to sea. You're considered resettled by the federal government. But in addition to that, the Department of Health and Human Services also has additional programs, and Cleveland's pretty blessed to have many of those programs throughout our resettlement agencies, as well as other programs throughout the Refugee Services Collaborative. Those programs address issues of mental health, physical health, as well as a program for the people who have survived torture abroad, etc. I think I've covered most of the points there. Adrian, I'll hand it back over.
Yeah, I think an important thing to note is that the U.S. government has extended refugee resettlement benefits to parolees, which is why we're talking about this. So what a refugee would get is similar to what a parolee. It's not as extensive as what a refugee would the benefits that they have, but it's getting pretty close, especially after September 30th and that continuing resolution. Like I stated earlier, there is a vetting process first abroad, and the process continues while the individual is at the military base inside the United States. The purpose of any vetting process is to ensure the security, medical, and criminal screening of each Afghan seeking admittance into the United States. The screening and security is conducted by a combination of intelligence, law enforcement, and counterterrorism professionals from across the government. They're conducting these screenings and security vetting for all SIV applicants and all other vulnerable Afghans that want to be placed in the United States. This includes both a review of biographic and biometric data. And I do know that this includes running an FBI fingerprint check, and officials are looking for things like biographical information, including names, dates of birth, and affiliations. Once that's complete and the individual moves on to the next phase of processing, they will either be resettled in the United States or they'll leave the military base and be reunited with a U.S. tie, either or.
All right. Thank you, Matt. Adrian. So I know the question of a lot of people's minds are, what impact these parolees are going to have on the U.S. and Cleveland. So this next question is for Joe. So Global Cleveland has commissioned Rust Belt Analytica to conduct a study on immigrants' impact on the greater Cleveland economy. The study was conducted over several years, and the results have been extremely positive. Joe, can you explain what the study found and how welcoming Afghan parolees will have an extremely positive impact on the greater Cleveland area?
Sure. Thanks, Patrick. And thank you, Patrick. Full disclosure, Patrick's on our board, and we love you. Patrick, you're my favorite board member. I did look through the names to make sure nobody else was on the call, but thank you. It's been great working with the folks at Catholic Charities and Refugee Response, not only in the legal clinic, but obviously one of our jobs at Global Cleveland is to be advocates. And something kind of historical happened this week that didn't get a lot of press. But for the first time in the history of Cuyahoga County, the Cuyahoga County government issued an RFP to organizations that serve refugees and immigrants and parolees and newcomers in ways that the county itself can be more engaged in the work of what's happening. And that's really key because you said it, Patrick, there's a real benefit to the newcomers coming to Cleveland. We know that from a study that was done by the Chmura Economic Analytics Group that was commissioned through Catholic Charities and Refugee Response, us together in USCRI a few years ago, that actually showed the dollar impact of this specific community of newcomers here in Cleveland in terms of job fulfillment. This morning, 4 phone calls from companies that are looking for workers, none of them under the $20 an hour wage. It's a real issue where, right, usually there's been an interesting dichotomy in Cleveland where there's been less jobs, but enough housing. And I would just say right now, the biggest thing that we've been working on, I think all of us and the resettlement agencies, as well as the Refugee Response, Asia, Ohio, and Building Hope in the City, which are the 3 support agencies to the Catholic Charities, USCRI, and Us Together Cleveland's, is finding the housing for people. Because the thing that we're talking about today is so important, which is people coming from Afghanistan. But don't forget that we're starting to get back to normal numbers again in terms of refugee resettlement in general. So while everyone's focusing on the Parolees and our friends coming from Afghanistan, there's also going to be quite a few people coming from other places because we went from about 1,300 in 2016 to about 350 in 2020. And that number is going to get closer to the 2016 numbers. So what you have right now is a real rush. So I would just say, in addition to the economic development benefit, one of the things that it keeps me up at night is trying to figure out how can we all do more to find those houses and apartments and places where people can go. And that's obviously something that's really important because they will be in neighborhoods that maybe didn't have people from all over the world before. And so what we've been trying to do at Global Cleveland is make sure that they have a soft landing. But the economic development aspect, Patrick, is clear. The community development in terms of housing is a real opportunity for us. We know that housing is a crisis. But the truth, what this really conversation gets to, I know we're talking about the law and we're talking about visas, is this kind of gets to the heart of who we are as Clevelanders. All the organizations that are on this call, so many of the lawyers that are involved were involved when the fall of Saigon happened, or when there was a conflict in Ethiopia. And I remember that as a kid, seeing Ethiopians moving into the St. Clair Superior neighborhood. We didn't know really that much about Ethiopia, but they were welcomed here, mostly through Catholic Charities and USCRI. Then in the 90s, the people fleeing the Kosovo conflict. So this is something that's kind of like part of our muscle memory. And it's just a matter of people, I think responding to it. And there's just been so many people who've wanted to help. And that's why it's so critical to have this conversation, because the humanitarian parole piece, the SIV, the P1, P2, these visa conversations are really important, but so is it going to be when people start to land and how we make sure that they integrate into the community as quickly and successfully and lovingly as possible.
Thank you, Joe. And just to recap, the studies specifically, I don't know if you know the exact dollar amount, but economic wise, what did the studies show of these immigrants being welcomed into our city?
The dollar amount that was done by the Chmura study, which was closer to the nose in terms of the refugees, was, I believe, 3 or 4 to 1, meaning that for every dollar that was spent, or if there was some kind of investment that was made in a person coming here, the return on investment over, and I believe the analytics study was about a 10-year span, was about 3 to 1. And when you think about it, the amount of support we're giving these individuals really isn't that much. And the fact is they have to start working immediately. So they start paying taxes immediately. This is before they even have citizenship, right? So these are folks that are contributing to the economy, fulfilling workforce needs, spending money at grocery stores, buying gas, doing what they have to do. And so it really makes a lot of sense that immigration is economic development. Refugees equal prosperity for everybody. And yes, we're doing this because it's the right thing to do. But when you talk about the metrics and the numbers, it's also the most economic, smart thing we can do. And in a state where we've just lost a congressperson because of our population decline, every single person that we can add to the population of Ohio, and specifically Northeast Ohio, means that all of us have more representation in Congress, which I don't think I need to say to anybody on this call how absolutely important that is in this dynamic time of our democracy.
Thank you, Joe. And that's fantastic news. I wish anybody that's on this call, please spread the word that immigrants are an economic driving force in our community, and it is backed by research. So we want to make sure that everybody knows that. Now, the next question is going to be for all of our panelists, if each one wants to take a couple minutes. So, basically what we've talked about is all more of, what's happened and some of the processes. But really, we need to know how we can help these people. So how can Clevelanders help in the legal process? How can they help with donations, with shelter, with food, with clothing? And who can Clevelanders contact to get more information? And how can Clevelanders get involved? I guess, Adriana, go, and then Francis, Matt, and Joe, you can follow up in the last.
Yeah, so I could start with the legal side of it. Obviously, everyone who comes to the United States on parolee status, or even if they don't, even on another status, they're eventually going to need immigration assistance. So there are not enough immigration attorneys in Ohio. So if you've thought about studying immigration law, now's the time to do it, or picking that up. So there are still a lot of Afghan community members that are here now that need assistance with humanitarian parole applications. We're getting a lot of requests for that. That's a way that they can assist. For the ones that we've already filed, or we filed through, the cases that we place with pro bono attorneys, those are going to need assistance with step 2, step 3, step 4 of the process to bring their family members here. Our office, we have 5 attorneys, but we don't have the capacity to take that many cases. So we've been using the assistance of pro bono attorneys and a lot of the law students in the area, and we really appreciate their help. And Andy can talk more about the social service aspect and the teams that Catholic Charities has to support the various needs of the parolees coming in.
Thank you.
Oh, sorry. Should I go next, or?
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay. So what we've done at Catholic Charities is effectively make distribution lists of different ways in which you can get involved. If someone wants to get involved with assisting with providing transportation for Afghan parolees that have arrived, or refugees, you have to go through a basic Refugee 101, a background check, as well as a Veritas training, which is required by Catholic Charities. And then you get placed on a list where you're alerted to different opportunities that come up over time. In addition, with our clients, the I-131 is an extraordinarily expensive filing fee. It's $500, I think $75. So donations to our legal department also go a very long way with relieving some of the financial burden for families. And English conversation partners as well, sort of a person who will be non-judgmental, who's willing to walk along with the person. And then finally, if you have a lead on rental properties, letting our office know, because as Joe mentioned, things are very tight right now, and it's hard to find appropriately sized houses for some larger families in Cleveland and the greater area. And I'll stop there. I think I've covered most of the major ones, and sorry for going out of order there.
You're right. Thanks, Andy. Go ahead, Francis.
Sure. And like Adriana mentioned, these individuals who come to the United States, they're going to have to apply for some legal status at some point. Now, the options are pretty limited right now. And so what people can do is contact their congressperson to try to get some sort of, not only just general immigration reform, but some sort of eligibility for permanent residency for the Afghan entrants. Because right now, we've got the 3 options I talked about. Parole, which Adriana talked about, that's only a temporary measure. You come here temporarily, it's valid for 2 years, you can apply for a work permit, but it's going to expire at the end of the 2 years. And you can extend it at the discretion of the Immigration Service. So there's no permanent benefit for these individuals. They could apply for asylum, but asylum has a pretty high standard. You have to show that you have encountered past persecution or found a fear of future persecution, and has to be on a protected ground whether it's your political opinion or your nationality or you're part of some protected group. But hopefully there's going to be some movement on a pathway to permanent residency for these Afghan parolees.
Thank you, Francis. Joe?
I'll just say, if you go to our website, Global Cleveland, we have a landing page that's got Catholic Charities, Us Together, USCRI, Building Hope in the City, Refugee Response in Asia, Ohio's websites. Cash is needed by everybody. Adriana said it earlier, the one legal clinic that we did with Refugee Response and Catholic Charities was about $180,000 that we raised in a matter of about 3 or 4 days. But we're still getting requests from people. And obviously there's a lot of lawyers who are on this call who might be willing to do some of the work pro bono, thank you. But $575, as Andrew was saying, is pretty expensive. In addition to that, when people get here, how do we make sure that they have the furnishings they need? But I would just say the other thing is this too. We're a community that I think is very well versed in terms of taking away people who have been cast out from the world's wars, famine, and genocides. It is something that is very intuitive in our community. And things like this kind of remind people that, this is basically how Cleveland was formed, right? Whether it was people who were coming from places where they had to get out or they were looking for an economic opportunity. And so one of the things that I just hope, we realize is that the more that we do this, the more people we're going to get. Communities that are identified as welcoming in survey after survey of people in the international community, people communicate pretty well within their own communities, their Facebook chats, their WhatsApp streams, people who are on church, temple, or mosque conversation boards. And the more that we can kind of say that we are a welcoming place, as sometimes people say that's so performative, well, but it's something that I think, not every community can actually say and mean. And so it's so important that we have conversations like this and the word gets out. Just this morning, I was watching on social media, there's a really amazing person, Neha Curtis, a great TV personality who is taking a little bit of time off from work. I think it's maternity leave. In a matter of like 6 hours, she got people to buy furniture, clothing, and everything else that's all being delivered right now to one of the 3 resettlement agencies. And she's doing it from home. And there's something that everybody can do. Not everybody can be superheroes like Andy and Adriana, but there's a lot that we can all contribute. And so obviously, at Global Cleveland, we try to encourage that as much as possible.
Thank you so much, Joe. Now, we do have several viewer questions, but before we move on to those, this question is for the panelists. Is there anything that we miss in these questions that is of importance that we'd like to talk about? If not, then we'll move on to, oh, sorry, did someone? Nope, all right, if not, we'll move on to some of our viewer questions. And this is for all the panelists. How has COVID complicated this process?
I haven't seen too many reports on the COVID statistics from what I remember. I mean, I know that FEMA is scrambling to get the vaccines and the testing to all the military sites and to the lily pads abroad. That's what they're calling the military bases abroad. To ensure that individuals are tested before they arrived and vaccinated. I think I saw a statistic that said like the population of Afghanistan was like 3% vaccinated. So obviously that's going to create some kind of a struggle on our end, administratively to make sure everybody gets tested and screened while they're in the United States.
Okay, thank you. This next question is directed at Joe. Are Cleveland civic leaders organizing for a comprehensive community-wide approach to smooth the path of resettlement, including jobs and housing?
That's a constant conversation that we're having. We've talked to about 25 different mayors in the last month and a half. Mayors like Mayor Blackwell of Maple Heights, Mayor Ward of Lyndhurst, Mayor George of Lakewood, Mayor DePiro of Parma. And what we've tried to do is just kind of elevate this conversation to your question earlier, Patrick, about how important it is for Northeast Ohio to realize that this is a real benefit to us. And I'll say this, it's a real opportunity. They are organized and they're exceedingly welcoming. And we have a wall in our office that we are very proud of that's got about 48 of the cities and villages in Northeast Ohio who have proclaimed themselves to be welcoming communities. Now, what does that mean? That means that when these conversations are happening about how do you integrate people from other places, there is someone in leadership in that city government who talks to people like their police chiefs and their council members and their community and housing directors and their economic development directors, that this is a welcoming place and it's a strong signal. So I think there's a lot of receptivity, in fact, more than there's ever been. The fact that right now, Cuyahoga County is going through a process through an organization called Welcoming America, which is a national NGO that works to make communities more welcoming. And it does so through a series of metric measures that if an immigrant or a newcomer or a refugee or an asylee were to come to Cuyahoga County, their different departments are going through training right now on how to actually pass that and be an even more welcoming place. The county has initiated that. And a lot of people on this call have already been engaged in those conversations about how we make places like county government more welcoming. Our hope and prayer is that the city will go through that same process, City of Cleveland next year after the election, as well as some of the other cities. So I will say to you that I think the civic quotient of people's engagement is really high, but clearly the leadership of the organizations on the refugee side is something that's so critical in terms of being responsive to the need. But I will tell you, as somebody who was born in this community, who spoke English as a learning language, who's lived here his whole life, I'm sometimes surprised at how many mayors and managers and city governments are very welcoming to people. And it's just a nice reminder, I think, of the community that we live in.
Thank you so much, Joe. The next question is for Andrew. If you've been through Veritas training in the past, do you need to do it again to volunteer?
You would not need to. You just need proof of attendance, which is a certificate that's handed out at the end of the session. And the Veritas Online website also should keep track of it if it was uploaded. If not, we can figure something out.
And can you quickly explain, just in a couple sentences, what that training is, what it does, and what it allows someone to do?
So it's the way in which the Catholic Church in the United States has addressed the sex abuse scandal. It arms people with kind of an awareness of problematic behaviors from the perpetrators, and then ways in which you can control access to vulnerable populations. So the training is about a 3-hour training, and it's like I mentioned, it's just to make sure that we're providing the highest level of protection for the people that we serve.
Okay, thank you, Andy. I know, Francis, you said that it might take up to, or and Andy, you said this as well, might take up to 2 to 4 years to get Afghans through the process while they're living on U.S. military bases. Is there a way we can support, and how do we support them, if they're not here to Cleveland yet, and if they're being housed on a military base? Is that something that we can help with?
That isn't, I'm not sure the answer to that question, unless Andy, if you've heard of something, but I think I did hear that those bases are accepting donations, but those are the specific, that goes to the specific base. There's 8 different bases across the United States. Because obviously they're housing and feeding up to 60,000 people, so. Oh, and they're also, they're accepting volunteers for attorneys to go down and do like legal orientation presentations.
Okay, thank you, Jim. I don't see any more questions in the chat. Pega, is there other questions that I may have missed? I have another one coming in. What opportunities are there for law students to in the area to assist in this process?
We have a lot of opportunities for law students. We've been working with Case in Cleveland, and I think we have students helping us down in Dayton as well. At this point, we will be doing a training for some law students, and we can get that information out to the Cleveland Bar so they can spread the news. We're doing a training to teach them how to do something called DS 160s, which is the online application that individual has to file after a humanitarian parole application is conditionally approved. So we're going to need assistance with doing those. So we're recruiting law students to help with that.
Excellent.
And we always need interns, so come our way, please. We have postings at all the law schools.
And how easy is it to use the system to fill out the DS-160?
It's pretty easy. You just, yeah.
Thank you, Adrian. Is the CMBA or others offering immigration law training for lawyers who want to support on a pro bono basis?
I will, Adrian, I don't know if Catholic Diocese offers this. I know what happens from the legal aid standpoint, but I'll let Adrian begin.
We don't have a specific training because
Okay.
we don't have like a larger pro bono placement program. What we've been doing is just individually walking people through, but we could definitely benefit from a larger training to assist pro bono attorneys.
Yeah, Sheila, so at CMBA, all of our pro bono work is partnered with the Legal Aid Society of Cleveland. And I know that when it comes to a case-by-case basis, they can connect people with a relevant attorney in the relevant practice group within legal aid. And they have a giant sort of bevy of resources digitally as well. But we could certainly look into partnering for a training for this kind of work specifically. I don't know if Francis has any comments.
Well, I think that when Catholic Charities and Refugee Response and later Asia in Ohio did their clinics to help with these parole applications, they did have training at the beginning of it because they want to make sure the lawyers know what they're doing to prepare the paperwork. So I guess if there's another type of clinic or some sort of mass volunteer effort, then there could be people who could provide that kind of training in advance.
Thank you. Thank you, Francis. I don't see any more questions. I'll give our viewers just a few more seconds here to see if anyone else has another question to ask. And as I'm seeing none, thank you so much, Adrian, Andrew, Francis, Joe, Pega, for your time. Thank you for CMBA and the Asian American Bar Association for putting this on. Please get involved. These people need your help, and they're going to make Cleveland and Northern Ohio a much better place to live. So thank you very much for your time, everybody. Have a wonderful day.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, everyone. This concludes our hot talk.